Secretary of State for Business, Jonathan Reynolds.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I wish to make a statement on the announcement by Stellantis yesterday on the future of their manufacturing sites in the United Kingdom. Can I begin by saying I know yesterday was a dark day for Luton. This is an iconic plant, powered by a talented workforce, and there are very few people in the town who don't know someone who works at the site. I want to outline the steps the government has taken to try and prevent this outcome and how we're going to support the industry and the area going forward. Mr. Speaker, the Transport Secretary and I found out about the challenges at this site just 10 days after the election. The global CEO told us he felt extremely frustrated by the lack of action from the previous government, which meant his desire was to close the Luton plant. Since then, we have been involved in intense negotiations with the company to try and find a way to keep the site open. Following these initial meetings, in July of this year, the company announced its intention to conduct a review of its operations in response to the significant pressures they were facing in key markets. Following the review, the company set out plans on Tuesday, which will see manufacturing at the two current Stellantis plants consolidated into a single location. We were and are aware that Stellantis has significant excess capacity across Europe. The company's talk of efficiency and investment elsewhere will, of course, be positive for their bottom line, but it will come as no comfort to the workers affected. For over a century, Vauxhall as a brand has been synonymous with Luton, and we are bitterly disappointed to hear that this relationship looks likely to end. Our number one priority is the people of Luton, who will, of course, be devastated by this decision. News like this rips through the heart of communities, sending shockwaves beyond those immediately impacted, through their families, their communities, and the businesses they support. I myself grew up in a car community, and I know what it is like when half the street work at the same site. We have asked the company to urgently share their full plans with us and to work with the government so that every single worker who is impacted receives the support they deserve. The Department for Work and Pensions stands ready to help anyone affected with the rapid response service designed exactly for these kinds of scenarios. It provides vital support and advice to both employers and their employees facing redundancy. I want the House to be aware that we have done everything we possibly can to prevent this closure from happening. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, and I met Stellantis many times over the summer and again on Tuesday morning to discuss the situation and the acute pressures the company is facing. We've worked hard to find a solution that would support the business and ensure people kept their jobs, and we confirmed in writing we were willing to consider any solution put forward. However, despite our best efforts, we have been forced to accept that this is ultimately a commercial decision by Stellantis as they respond to wider challenges within the sector. And I'll be frank with honourable members. These challenges are not confined to any one company. Car manufacturers around the world are battling with increased costs, supply chain issues, and changing consumer demand in a highly competitive, fast-evolving market. Honourable members will know that last week, Ford also announced 800 job losses in the UK over the next 3 years as part of a major restructuring programme across the whole of Europe. Many of the challenges faced by our car manufacturers are global in nature, and they cannot be resolved by UK government intervention alone. And whilst this announcement is not what we wanted, nor what we worked towards, we must not mischaracterise this. It categorically does not signal a retreat by Stellantis from the UK. The plans announced by the company will also see them investing £50 million as they consolidate manufacturing at their Ellesmere Port plant in Cheshire. Honourable members will know that Ellesmere Port is the UK's first all-battery electric vehicle plant, and Stellantis' decision to bring production of the Vauxhall electric van to there is welcome. We will, of course, continue to work closely with the company on next steps of the consolidation process, including the proposal to offer affected workers a relocation package to take up roles at Ellesmere Port. The investments being made at Ellesmere Port and elsewhere demonstrate that there are real opportunities for UK manufacturing as part of the move to zero-emission vehicles. But this transition has to be properly managed, and it requires a government that's on the pitch, something the car industry finally now has in this government. The government is determined to support automotive companies as they revamp their production lines, adjust their business plans, and develop the technology needed for the next generation of zero-emission vehicles. These cars and vans are greener, they're cleaner, and they're essential to our net zero ambitions. Roughly 30% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions come from cars, vans and lorries. To tackle this and wean our country off imported fossil fuels, we do need emission vehicles. But this government is resolute that this transition must be done in partnership between government, industry and, of course, consumers. And that is why my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, and I are listening closely to the concerns of the automotive industry and the wider sector about the transition to electric vehicles and the Conservative Party's zero-emission vehicle mandate. We held a roundtable earlier this month to hear directly from major automotive companies, from the SMMT and the charging sector. And in response, we will be shortly fast-tracking a consultation on our manifesto commitment to end the sales of new purely petrol and diesel cars by 2030. But we will use that consultation to engage with industry on the previous government's ZEV transition mandate and the flexibilities contained within it. And we will welcome on board their feedback as we move forwards. We want to do everything we can, together with industry, to secure further investment into the British automotive sector now and over the long term. It is why in the budget, the Chancellor committed £2 billion in R&D and capital funding to support the zero-emissions vehicle manufacturing sector and supply chain. And our industrial strategy will also give the automotive sector the certainty it deserves and send a clear signal to global boardrooms that this government is in this for the long term. We want to invest alongside them, create a policy environment that allows them to prosper and help them do what they do best, bringing good jobs to every part of this country. And through the National Wealth Fund, we're unlocking billions in private investment to invest in new green infrastructure, including gigafactories, supporting growth and job creation, not just in the automotive sector, but in the wider economy too. And we're working with investors to build a globally competitive electric vehicle supply chain in the UK, laying the foundations for growth over the long term. Mr. Speaker, the closure of the Luton plant by Stellantis is a bitter blow to our car industry, to Luton and to the workers who made Vauxhall a world-class brand producing world-class cars and vans. But we must not lose sight of the fact that these vehicles will continue to be designed and built here in the UK at Ellesmere Port. And that matters to me and it matters to the government. When I say decarbonisation must not mean deindustrialisation, I mean it. Winning the race to net zero and having a world-leading automotive sector must go hand in hand. We must never undermine the transition as the previous government did, but we will be pragmatic on ensuring regulation and incentives are working as they should. Contrived culture wars are not what this industry needs. Instead, it needs a partner in government ready to look at the practical solutions necessary, and we stand ready to do that. And I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State Andrew Griffiths.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. This is a sad day for the 1,100 workers at the Luton Vauxhall factory, and our thoughts are first and foremost with them and their families. They are the most recent custodians in a long history that goes back to 1905, when their factory opened the doors for the first time. Luton-built white vans are icons of British business, representing to many the hard graft and skill of millions of traders, the self-employed and small businesses across this country. Mr. Speaker, we on these benches stand by these hard-working people. We're on the side of the plant's workers because we know the value of skilled work and the transformative power of British business. The closure of the Luton plant, I fear, is just a down payment on jobs that will be lost under this government's relentless attacks on industry, its neglect of the realities of business, and its failure to meet its promise not to raise taxes. The government owes it to the plant's workers to at least be honest. This decision is the direct result of a government policy that is simply unworkable for industry. Stellantis told us as much when they said that this decision was made in the context of the zero emissions mandate. The Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders has said that the UK situation is particularly acute, with arguably the toughest targets and most accelerated timeline on the world. And there are unsustainable business costs undermining UK industry. The government's policy on zero-emission vehicles is a jobs killer. They say they've been talking since July. So why today, Mr. Speaker, this panicked U-turn when it's already too late? Under the last government, we acknowledged that the previous vehicle mandate was too stringent. We took the decision to push this back, recognising the impact that it would have on industry. We listened to Unite the Union on this. His party unilaterally reversed those changes and brought the deadline forward to 2030. Instead of Unite, he listened to the member for Climate Central in Doncaster North. But even today, the Secretary of State speaks of ending the sale of new purely petrol and diesel cars by 2030. He's tried to slip a subtle change in there, the consequences of which are significant. And whilst I welcome that for once this government has listened to business, he appears to be misleading them at the same time. Can he explain exactly what his policy is? There are real costs, as we see today, to these targets. And instead of having the courage to stand up and recognise that he was wrong, his solution appears to be yet another consultation which is yet to take place. How many automotive businesses has the Secretary of State spoken to about these targets? And in any of his conversations with Stellantis, did they ask him at any point to remove the fines on their business? Has he met with the Right Honourable Member for Doncaster to entreat him to row back from his ideological pursuit of domestic targets, ignoring the fact that they are exporting jobs, exporting British jobs, Mr. Speaker, to more carbon-intense economies? But most of all, we mustn't ignore the elephant in the room about the timing of this decision. This follows a budget that has declared war on business, a triple whammy of tax rises that removes incentives for growth and investment, a 25 billion jobs tax which has left boardrooms across the country putting recruitment and pay rises on hold, and alongside an employment rights bill written hand in hand with his union paymasters that's already deterring businesses from hiring in Britain. Businesses are ringing the alarm bells. The CBI, the British Retail Consortium, UK Hospitality and the Society of Motor Manufacturers have all said the pressures on business are too much to swallow. Open letter after open letter, statement after statement, Labour are not on their side. They lied about their plans. They're attacking working people, and now they're attacking the vans they go to work in. The businessmen and women who gave Labour the benefit of the doubt are regretting it. When will the Secretary of State listen? When will his government abandon its attack on British business? Will he lead the charge to change course? And why won't he suspend the fines and targets which have led to today's tragedy?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, that is the single most dishonest statement I've ever heard in the time in this House.
I'm sure the honourable gentleman will be withdrawing that comment.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to clarify some of the points the honourable gentleman raised on the other bench. The ZEV mandate policy is a...
We're on the same side. We'll be quiet, won't we? Secretary of State.
The ZEV mandate policy, the Shadow Minister mentioned, is a policy of the previous government, of which he is aware. The changes the previous government made were not to the ZEV mandate. They were not pragmatic on it. They changed the destination and kept the fines and the ramp-up and the thresholds exactly the same. So what they did was give no flexibility or pragmatism in how that policy operated, but still undermined the transition, leading to a massive reduction in consumer confidence. And he asks, has the honourable gentleman talked to industry? I was the guest speaker at the SMMT dinner last night. 1,000 people there from every bit of the automotive sector. They are absolutely clear that it's the destination they support. It's the Conservative government, the previous Conservative government's policy as to how this operates, which is causing them the problems. And as I said in the statement, if he was listening, or if he'd read it in advance, 10 days in to this government, we were told this plant was likely to close. It is on this side of the House that we've acted with pragmatism, been willing to look at any part of this policy in order to make sure this outcome didn't happen. The simple truth was that it was too late after 14 years of failure to be able to put this right. So I just have to say to him, with all politeness, he is out of touch with industry, he is out of touch with workers, he's even out of touch with what the previous Conservative government did, and I think that speaks for itself.
Chair of the Select Committee, Liam Burns.
This is indeed a hard day for Luton, and I welcome what the Secretary of State had to share with the House today, and I welcome the review that he's announced of the zero-emission mandate. As part of that review, I do hope that he looks again at the perversities of the regime that he inherited that could involve makers of petrol engines in this country transferring credits to companies like Elon Musk's Tesla and Chinese EV makers. But if we really want to make sure that there is a level playing field, Mr. Speaker, why don't we reverse the decision of the last Secretary of State, follow the EU Commission and launch anti-subsidy investigations into Chinese EV makers? The Trade Remedy Authority is ready to go. It just needs the Secretary of State to give the green light.
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to the Chair of the Select Committee and indeed for our exchanges we had in the committee evidence session yesterday. He is right to say that what we have inherited is a position where how the policy operates, the flexibilities that are contained within it, and the fact that no domestic producer is on track means effectively the transfer he has described is the problem. That is when I say decarbonisation cannot mean deindustrialisation. It is precisely that we've inherited that we are critiquing. Now, we don't want to undermine the transition in the way the previous Prime Minister did, because anyone in industry in this sector will be able to tell honourable members opposite how disastrous that was. But what we need to give is breathing space and making sure that that policy is operating in a way which doesn't have any of the kind of perverse incentives he's described. Now, on the subsidies point and the trade remedies and the potential response from the UK, we've got to bear in mind two things. First of all, the system we've inherited, it is industry itself which makes the application for that. I do have powers as Secretary of State to do that, though they've never been used to my knowledge. But we must also remember that the UK automotive sector is a world-class export-led sector. If we were to go in any kind of protectionist route on principle, we've got to bear in mind what it would mean for the markets we sell those vehicles into. If you sell 80% of your product abroad, it is the international export position you've got to consider alongside the domestic market. But I say again, if industry makes that request, of course it would be followed in accordance with the way the system operates.
Clive Jones, the Liberal Democrat spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Secretary of State for the advance copy of his statement. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I also attended the Society of Motor Manufacturer and Traders annual dinner, same as the Secretary of State, and greatly appreciated the opportunity to hear directly from a sector that is so important to the British economy. UK car manufacturing brings billions of pounds into our economy and employ hundreds of thousands of people directly and many more thousands of people across their supply chain. They are at the forefront of the green transition and in making transport sustainable for the future via electric vehicles. And most importantly, they are always willing to be frank with me and other politicians because they reaffirm to me that the industry sees major hurdles on the horizon. And the closure of Vauxhall's 100-year-old factory in Luton is a sign of great troubles ahead. Inevitably, the Conservatives are going to play politics with this announcement, but there is still no apology from them for trashing the economy. There is not one moment of reflection that the previous government's policy on electric vehicles was a disaster. It simply did not do enough on infrastructure and incentives, and therefore the government need to fix the Tories' mess. As a starting point, the government urgently need to work with Vauxhall to mitigate what will be a major shock for this area. The government have said that it will fast-track a consultation, but that needs to be fast-tracked today. Mr. Speaker, urgency is the key. When will the consultation start, and when does the Minister expect it to report? The previous government did not do enough to incentivise people to buy electric vehicles, nor did it provide the right infrastructure. What is the government doing to increase sales of electric vehicles and to increase the number of charging points in places like my constituency of Wokingham?
Seriously.
Grateful to him for his questions and his observations, and apologies. He's had to hear me speak twice on this in the short passage of time from last night till today. But he asks the Conservative Party to apologise for their economic record. That case stands for itself. But I would also like to know, given how urgently this was presented to us as a new government, what they were doing at the end of the last government. What did they know? What conversations were they aware of? Because certainly what we inherited was a position of extreme frustration from the company. I can't imagine that hadn't been conveyed in some way to our predecessors. There were policies in terms of specific questions in the budget around charging infrastructure. I recognise that's a key part of this, as well as the £2 billion for the R&D, Automotive Transformation Fund, and the partnership with business that we use that for. He asks on the consultation, obviously that will come from the Department of Transport. Shadow Secretary of State asked about why that's a consultation. Well, the previous government set these policies in primary legislation, so he knows there are processes to follow in order to do that. Any conversation about the thresholds and the existing policy, that is for my honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport. But I go back to this point about how the system works, the flexibilities, the allowances, how we can make sure that we are giving automotive manufacturers in the UK a system that lets them get to the transition they want and the consumer wants, but does it in a way which works with industry to enable that transition to happen for the benefit of the United Kingdom.
Rachel Hopkins.
I'm grateful again, Mr. Speaker, and I refer to my register of interest as a trade union member and also someone with friends who have heard that they've lost their jobs. Closing the Luton site will damage our local economy, with 600 jobs at risk, more in the supply chain, and workers and families receiving this devastating news just before Christmas. I welcome the comments from the Secretary of State saying decarbonisation must not mean deindustrialisation and the decimation of good, skilled jobs. Will his announcement today move the dial in discussions with Stellantis to help protect the Luton site? And I welcome his tone of taking this seriously compared to members opposite. So will he join me in visiting workers and their trade union representatives at the Luton site to listen to their concerns?
Secretary of State.
Extremely grateful to my honourable friend for her question, and I believe everyone in the House who cares about the automotive sector and working people in this country will share the sentiments that she has put forward about the scale of what this will mean for Luton. I can absolutely promise her, yes, I'll take up her invitation to come with her to the site. I can also promise her the full deployment of my department and indeed all of my colleagues across government to whatever help is required. We are in conversations with Stellantis, as the union are, I believe, about the details of the package that will be presented to the workforce, but of course I'll engage closely with her and her honourable friend for the other side of Luton in order to make sure that it's to the maximum benefit of her constituents in the wider area.
Blake Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a Bedfordshire MP, I know how significant the Vauxhall plant is to our local economy and as a local employer. The Minister has explained how devastating this will be for families locally, not just in Luton, but also in my constituency in mid-Bedfordshire. But the Minister, unfortunately, has said very little about how he's going to support the people that are losing their jobs. Is the Minister concerned that this government's tax on jobs will make it much more difficult to replace the 1,000 manufacturing jobs in Bedfordshire?
Grateful to him for his sentiments, but the straightforward answer to that question is no. This is a skilled and talented workforce. They haven't lost their jobs because of any deficiencies on their part. They have been in a position where the combination of the overcapacity in Europe, I mean, I'll be frank, I believe from the minute we came to office, I think this closure was already what the company intended and has nothing to do whatsoever with government policy. I recognise the pressures on the existing policy we've inherited, hence the pragmatism on our part as a government to make sure that's working for the transition. But I have absolutely no doubt whether these workers choose to take advantage of the relocation offer or are in demand elsewhere. They're brilliant, talented people who will be in demand.
Sarah Owen.
Mr. Speaker, may I refer members to my register of interests. Before I start, I want to put on record that the 1,100 people that will be losing their jobs in Luton today deserved much better than the response from the Conservative front bench. It was very far from factual and it was very far from serious. I thank the Secretary of State for their statement and welcome any support for Vauxhall workers and their families who are understandably devastated by Stellantis' decision, especially this close to Christmas. This follows the closure of the Skeff plant in Luton North. after a century of manufacturing earlier this year. Like them, Vauxhall is, or was, synonymous with Luton. Stellantis' callous decision will impact our whole town, our whole region even. So what support will be offered to not just the skilled and dedicated Vauxhall workers who are losing their jobs, but also to our whole town as a whole to cope with the loss of this manufacturing giant which Luton helped build?
Tuesday.
Grateful to my honourable friend for her question as well, and echo the sentiments I gave to her constituency neighbour in my earlier question. The timing of this, I think, the whole decision is regrettable, but the timing is particularly regrettable around it. As I said in my statement, we have done everything we can since the new government came into power on the 5th of July to try to avoid this. I reiterated the offers I had made throughout the negotiating process in terms of both policy flexibility and indeed the potential of new government investment in the site, but regrettably it was not possible to change this decision. The support that I have made clear is available. I reiterate that promise, and I do say, despite in fact I would not want to minimise the impact of this in any way. I believe her area is a place of considerable economic strength, firms in engineering and aerospace, in air travel, in the creative industries. There's a lot to be optimistic about for the future, but that doesn't take away the bitterness of this particular blow for Luton at this time. I recognise that.
John Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I make clear that we on this side regard this as a very grave matter? We are taking this seriously, and we are also dealing in facts. Yep. Turning then to veracity, can we hear whether or not Stellantis raised the question of the eye-watering ZEV mandate fines? Did they ask for them to be lifted?
I'm grateful to him for his question. Yes, in the conversations we had with them, they raised every aspect of the previous government's policy in terms of the flexibilities, the ability to cap and trade, some of those allowances, what it would mean for the bottom line. And I take those concerns seriously. That's why I'm willing, in a way that does not undermine the destination, to consult on how this policy works alongside my colleague, the Secretary of State for Transport. Because whilst I feel the previous government's aspiration, I understand why they did this policy, I don't think they considered, when the decision was made, the kind of falling demand in Europe which we have seen. And I think we have to work pragmatically across all bits of government to make sure this policy is not having the kind of outcomes which I think many of us who are aware of how exactly this works do share.
Matt Weston.
Mr. Speaker, I refer members to my declaration of interest. I welcome the Secretary of State's statement. I'm greatly saddened by the decision, and may I suggest that plant rationalisation, platform rationalisation would have been a major factor. Let's be honest, the industry wanted certainty, but the challenge faced by automotive manufacturers in meeting the ZEV mandate, introduced by the last government, is more stringent than in Europe and most other markets. Put simply, consumer uncertainty was introduced by the last government. So I find the remarks of the Shadow Minister disingenuous. Can I urge the government to introduce more flexibility in the annual targets?
Disingenuous is aimed at a particular person. We don't do that. You've been here long enough, and I'm sure you want to withdraw it immediately.
I withdraw that, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Can I urge the government to introduce more flexibility in the annual targets 24 to 29, introduce consumer incentives, and consider redirecting any penalties towards EV charging infrastructure and not to Chinese government car companies?
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend as well. I think he makes some very good points about the fact that whilst nearly every major market has policies of this kind, ours does operate in a different way, say to, for instance, how the French proceeded with theirs. I agree with him that the major failing of the former Prime Minister's speech was to keep this policy in place but change the destination, which really makes no coherence whatsoever. You should do one or the other logically. To do both undermines confidence and still doesn't give the kind of pragmatic flexibilities we're talking about today. And the specific things that he mentioned will all be part of the consultation my honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, will lead on.
Sir Julian.
I assure the Secretary of State that the question I'm about to ask I would have put to a Conservative minister equally. And that is this. If all British car manufacturers came together and told the government that they could not possibly meet this 2030 goal, would the government nevertheless persevere in maintaining it as an immovable target?
Well, I would recognise the honourable gentleman's fairness and equity, whichever side of the House he's sitting on, and have no doubts about that. We do listen to industry. We have that very close relationship with them, and that is why we understand that the destination they want is 2030. The pressures of the system are in the next few years because of a situation which I don't believe, and I'm saying this in good faith to Conservative members, I don't believe government ministers at the time considered this set of European and global economic factors in terms of the particular decisions that they made. So that's why we've got to get this balance right. We should also recognise, given we are an export-led automotive producer, that if we weren't being ambitious about the transition, we'd lose our export markets because we wouldn't have anything to sell because other countries have these policies, and that is where the consumer is going. It's about how we support the transition, and that's where we work so closely with industry.
Antonio Batts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw attention to the Register of Interests as a member of Unite the Union. Can I thank the Secretary of State for coming to the House today on such a difficult day for the car industry. All of our thoughts are with the workers in Luton today. I wanted to ask the Secretary of State to thank him for the work he's doing, engaging with the industry and with unions on a better way forward on electric vehicle targets. This news is really disappointing, but does the Secretary of State agree with me that we can and should be positive about the future of the automotive industry in this country? It matters to me locally as the MP for many, many businesses in the automotive supply chain, as I know it matters to many members across the House.
I thoroughly agree with the content and sentiment of my honourable friend's question. That support this government is committed to is about that transition, but we should be excited by what British manufacturers are doing. We should be excited by what JLR, what Nissan, what Toyota are doing. We should be excited, I mean, in the supercar, the luxury end of the market from McLaren and Rolls-Royce. I could mention all of our iconic brands. There's a lot of exciting things going on. And if honourable members aren't aware of that, these are all manufacturers more than happy to host members of Parliament coming to visit. So I'd encourage people who aren't aware of the situation to do that. But they will explain the pressures they're under in the short term, and they will endorse the change of policy this government is putting forward today.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. The Electric Vehicles Association say that 14 NGOs, think tanks and campaign groups are advocating to uphold the ZEV mandate. We have just seen the most devastating storms, dangerously accelerated by climate change. I know the government knows that net zero is not negotiable. The previous government has persistently undermined the motor manufacturing industry. Will this government listen to the Electric Vehicle Association, who are, after all, supporting this government in its ambition to get to net zero?
Mr. Speaker, I genuinely appreciate the question from the other perspective, if you like, to this, because it's not just NGOs, there's a big business element that we've been in close contact with about charging infrastructure, and I understand that. And I just want to make clear, that is why we are not undermining the transition. That's why we are ambitious with industry for where we get to. Nothing we are going to propose as a government will itself reduce or limit the deployment of electric vehicles. What I'm talking about, what we are talking about as a government, is looking at how the flexibilities, for instance, in the system operate. So we are doing everything we can alongside industry to get to that destination. So I want nothing to do with the approach from the previous government, which did have a really detrimental effect on the industry, and they will tell any honourable member that very clearly. But I'm listening to what it means to have this, frankly, change in economic circumstances in terms of demand, private demand for electric vehicles, and want to work with industry to get to the place, the destination I think we both strongly support.
Bill Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The previous government were warned, including multiple times in this chamber, about the damage they were doing to the car industry before the election. The constant changes of policy on net zero, the missing of targets on the rollout of charge points, the failure to even allocate the rapid charge fund, all of these undermined consumer confidence. So can I ask my right honourable friend to make sure that after his review, and as soon as possible, he balances up the needs of manufacturers of cars and vans with the needs of consumers?
I believe the analysis from my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I think he and I were in the chamber several occasions where this case was made to the previous government. I mean, look, The intervention from the former Prime Minister was not based in any kind of business or economic logic. It was an attempt to create some sort of wedge issue before the election, which frankly did them absolutely no good because people saw straight through it. I say again, to change the deadline but keep the existing thresholds in place up until 2030 was the worst of all worlds. It did have a really negative impact on consumer confidence, excuse me, and we will never repeat those mistakes.
Jerome Baines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has said in his statement that at the time of the election, Stellantis were minded to close the plant. But since the election, we've had the budget, which has imposed £25 billion of increased taxes on business. We've had the Employment Rights Bill, which is going to increase costs on business enormously as well. And both of those have directly led to a collapse in business confidence. So does the Secretary of State think those decisions help Stellantis to stay or go?
I can tell them categorically they had no impact whatsoever. And I think the crucial point is, I mean, I hear honourable members from the Conservative Party say this. Do you have any idea about employment conditions in the automotive sector? They're well above the floor the Employment Rights Bill raises this to in the United Kingdom. I mean, get out and talk to industry and have these conversations, please. Look, I'll just be clear. On the wider point he makes on business confidence, I recognise that the absolutely outrageous inheritance this government walked in on, where Conservative members did not plan to even say how they would pay for the existing promises that they made. That created speculation about where that revenue would come from, and I regret the fact we've had to make difficult decisions. I wouldn't ideally want to have to make those decisions, but we are the people fixing the foundations and clearing up the mess the Conservative Party left behind, and there can be no long-term prosperity unless you have a serious government willing to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer to the House to my register of interests. I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in paying tribute to my good friend and colleague, the MP for Luton South and South Bedfordshire, who is an absolute fierce champion for her constituents. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the news yesterday only highlights further the urgent need for a UK industrial strategy and demonstrates the challenges that the UK industry faced under the last government without the strategy in place?
Absolutely echo her sentiments in terms of our honourable friends and agree very much with her statement about a UK industrial strategy. There have been and are particular policies that have been particularly relevant to the automotive sector, but what we have lacked across a whole range of key sectors for a long time in the UK is confidence and certainty that those plans will remain. And people have talked in this statement about the actions of the previous Prime Minister in that intervention. That is exactly the opposite of what is required when it comes to long-term policy. So the advanced manufacturing sector is one of our 8 sectors in the industrial strategy. It is a sector of tremendous strengths in the United Kingdom, and our intention is to build on that, to grow that, to deliver even more success in future, and that's why it's such a fundamental part of our plans.
Thank you, sir. I commiserate with the workers at Luton who will lose their jobs. If Vauxhall is synonymous with Luton, then Ford is synonymous with Essex. The Minister referred to 800 Ford job losses, including at their research centre at Dunton, where many of my Rayleigh and Wickford constituents work. On electric vehicles specifically, I'm a free trader by instinct, but what China is now doing in that area is way beyond normal competitive practice. They are dumping electric vehicles very cheaply on world markets, a point highlighted by the chairman of the Select Committee. So what specifically are the government intending to do about that to maintain fair competition and to give British companies, including Ford and Vauxhall, a fair chance to compete?
Secretary of State. First of all, let me reiterate my words about his constituents and the situation at Ford. I would say if anyone, and I have faced this accusation before, thinks somehow the government is only listening to one part of industry or is responding to special pleading, I think the announcement from Ford, followed by what we have had this week from Stellantis, is proof that we do need to move, we do need to listen, we do need to look at some of the policies we've inherited and make sure they're working as they should. I reiterate my comments earlier on in the statement to the Chair of the Select Committee. The Trade Remedies Authority and the system that we've inherited, we haven't changed. If Ford or any other company want to make that referral against unfair competitive practices, they can do that. That request has not come from any part of industry to date. And I would say, look, I wouldn't for a second describe the Chinese economy as one that operates on the kind of market principles we would be familiar with. But we've got to be aware that the fundamental threat from China comes from their commitment to research and development, to innovation, to high-tech solutions, and to being able to manufacture on scale. We are kidding ourselves if we think the threat is just somehow unfair competition. This is an economy that has an incredible level of ambition for the future, and that's why we've got to raise our game as well.
Chris Edgley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents will be impacted by this deeply worrying announcement. So can the Secretary of State confirm what discussions he is having with trade unions on this specific subject and what plans he has to mitigate the job losses on residents in North East Hertfordshire?
Again, I wish to place on record and recognise the situation facing his constituents and the support on offer for the government. He asked specifically about conversations with trade unions. Yes, I can confirm I had several conversations just yesterday with, for instance, the General Secretary of Unite, Sharon Graham, and making sure that what we're doing as a government and what is being negotiated on behalf of the union, the recognised union for the workforce, are consistent with each other. I do recognise that for many people in the local area, the offer of relocation will not be an attractive one. People have links, they have families, they have situations. That is on offer as part of the deal. But as the details of this emerge, I promise the House will keep members of Parliament updated and work very closely with them to ensure it's everything it can be.
Richard Tash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's be honest, these job losses are a direct result of net zero, the previous government's EV targets, and what we are witnessing. Is the Secretary of State aware? Is he aware that car manufacturers across Europe are losing fortunes on EV production? They are trying to delay targets. And what we are witnessing is just the beginning of the slow, agonising, painful and tragic destruction of hundreds of thousands of direct and indirect jobs in the UK automotive industry.
I can certainly agree that we should be honest, and what the honourable gentleman said there was simply not correct as a characterisation of the UK automotive sector. And all I would ask him to do is don't listen to the government or even the opposition. Go and speak to the industry yourself. Go and speak to the firms involved in this. Ask them about their investment plans. Find out why the honourable gentleman is so out of touch with industry sentiment. Many of the problems in some other European countries have come from a lack of ambition on transition, because fundamentally, if we're selling 80% of what we make in the UK to other markets, there is no long-term market for internal combustion engines. You've got to recognise that and remember. And again, don't take it from the government, take it from industry. But I'm afraid on this one, again, as we had on our exchange, I believe, on steel a few months ago, honourable gentleman's just out of touch with what consumers and business want.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that, unlike the party opposite, this Labour government does not regard the words industrial strategy as anathema? And would he agree that UK industry in general, and the automotive sector specifically, suffered under the last government due to their laissez-faire, stand-aside approach?
Well, I very much do believe that industrial strategy is essential to the future of the United Kingdom. I still have hope that this will be something which is supported on a cross-party basis. I see no reason why Conservative members or anyone else would not support industrial strategy, and there have been Conservatives who've held the position or the predecessor positions to the one I hold who actually got this and believed in it, and I think did quite a good job in some quite difficult circumstances within the Conservative Party to do it. So yes, it's essential to this government, but I certainly hope the whole House will get behind our plans for Invest 2035, because the response from industry has been superb. It is what we need as a country, and we should all get behind that.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clearly it's a sad day for Luton and the workers there. But what the Secretary of State needs to remember is, of course, that this is not just about Luton. It's about the complete car manufacturing industry in this country. And there will be workers up and down the country in the industry saying, am I going to be next? So can the Secretary of State set out his position on the conversations that he's having with other car manufacturers to make sure the same thing doesn't happen to them?
Well, I reiterate the points I made in my statement, that this is about the whole sector, that whilst we had a position that we walked in to find in relation to this particular plant on the 5th of July when we formed the government, I recognise that alongside that particular issue, there are sector-wide issues here, which is why we've been having these conversations, and it's why we're willing to show the pragmatism we had in changing what we've inherited in terms of some of these policies to make sure they're working in a way which works for British industry. So you asked about specific conversations we've had. I said in my statement we had a meeting with all the major UK-based OEMs and wider representatives of the sector just last week to talk about the kind of flexibilities that might be required in order to make this policy work in a way which doesn't undermine British industry but gets us to the common destination industry and government and consumers hold together. So that is exactly what we are doing, and I would ask Conservative members, whatever they feel about the previous government's policy, to get behind that ambition too.
Tesserman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Success in transition to electrical vehicles is vital for the West Country and for Somerset in particular, with the new Agratas battery plant which is coming to Somerset, and actually the Port of Bristol, through which 500,000 vehicles a year go. Will the Secretary of State act to support consumers and consumer confidence through restoring the plug-in grant, please?
Secretary of State.
I can certainly assure my honourable member that I will do everything I can to bolster consumer confidence. I say all the time, the products made in the United Kingdom are great. If people, again, are unaware of just how great they are, go and book yourselves a test drive, go and visit the production lines, go and see how brilliant it is. The Agratas factory is an incredible investment. It will be a significant part. I've always said, for the long-term future of this particular sector, we must make the batteries in the United Kingdom. Ultimately, vehicles over the long term will be made where the batteries are made, and we've got to recognise that's a key part of the industrial strategy for this sector that needs to go forward. I can't make a particular announcement on the plug-in grant. As you will know, it's not within the Department of Business and Trade, but I can confirm to her that across government, whether it is the Treasury, whether it is the Department for Transport, the Department for Energy and Net Zero, we are all united in wanting to make this transition a success and willing to listen to honourable members like yourself and industry as to the policies necessary to do that.
Richard Hull.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. And in the Secretary of State's statement, he mentioned those job losses also at Ford at Dunton in my constituency. And can I thank the Shadow Minister, the MP for Croydon West, for speaking to me on the phone earlier this week about those job losses. I very much welcome the fast track of the review that the Secretary of State is putting forwards, but I also agree with my right honourable friend, the member for Rayleigh and Wickford and the Chair of the Select Committee, that we really do need to look after the manufacturers I've spoken to about the Chinese electric car dumping, potentially in the UK, and anything that, can he speak to that? But can he also answer as to whether concerns have also been raised with me from local car manufacturers about the increase in vehicle excise duty on some models in the budget, and if there is any possibility of perhaps looking at some of those issues again, because that is also having an impact on some of the demand for these vehicles in the UK.
Thank the honourable member for his question, and I'm grateful we've been able to get him some time with ministers about the serious situation affecting his constituents, which members of this government will always take seriously, as I do believe previous government ministers have under the previous administration. The particular issue around vehicle excise duty, I think he's referring to in the budget, obviously a question really for the Treasury and the Chancellor, but the differential that exists from the changes in the budget between internal combustion engines and electric vehicles is actually one of the demand incentives that now exists within the system for it. So I think everyone would recognise government should be doing everything it can to support industry around this transition, and measures like that are part of the answer. But of course, if he's got specific concerns, we'd always be willing to listen to those.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State was very robust in his criticism of the previous government and their approach to ZEV mandate. But wasn't the Secretary of State one of 141 Labour MPs who voted for that ZEV mandate?
Secretary of State.
Absolutely clear. The ZEV mandate that the previous Conservative government put forward, we worked constructively with them, and I believe in incentives towards the transition. I'm not arguing against that. It was the sheer brass neck that I reacted to of the opposition front bench for somehow not even recognising it was their policy that we were willing to change and presenting it as if the argument was the other way round. So I will be quite robust when the facts are as the facts are and the opposition front bench aren't willing to accept that. But look, I say again, we want this transition to work. It's not about the destination. It's not about, particularly even in this regard, the thresholds. It's about the flexibilities, how the policy operates, what it is currently meaning for market conditions in the United Kingdom. I think that is an entirely reasonable and proper response to what we have found walking through the door as a new government. And again, I see no reason why people can't pragmatically get on board and support that.
Lisa Smart.
very much, Mr. Speaker. One of the things that's stopping some of my constituents from transitioning to electric vehicles is a lack of access to charging points. He will know, as a constituency neighbour, that some of the housing stock in my patch lends itself more easily to personalised charging points than others. So what more can the government do to ensure everyone can access charging points to make the transition to EVs?
I absolutely agree that that is one of the concerns consumers have. I think that the principal concern for consumers on EV take-up is the cost of the vehicle itself, but this is, and she will know from our constituencies, it is difficult in some places to envisage the kind of infrastructure some people might take for granted in areas that have more capacity to have that built into properties and driveways. There are about 70,000 public chargers, EV chargers in the United Kingdom. It's important to recognise there's not always an equity across different parts of the country around that, but a lot of people are surprised to learn. I think we have more public chargers than, for instance, Norway has, which is very much the leader in electric vehicle rollout. There was specific money in the budget to expand the rollout of charge points, to build on that 70,000 already in place. But I think she's right to say it's a key concern to be taken into consideration, not just the overall number, but the equity of those around the country. I can promise that the Department of Transport's interested in that too.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for his statement, and in particular for his honesty. It's important to have that whenever we look at the bleak things we have before us, and thank him for that. The Minister will understand that with the cost of living crisis that our constituents are struggling through, the last thing on their mind is to afford, forgive me, an all-singing, all-dancing electric car when they're clearly struggling to pay their electric bill. The closure of the plant, which specifically highlights the lack of passion for electric cars, can come as no surprise. So what can government and the Minister do to make electric cars affordable for everyone, which would, I believe, enhance the need for car manufacturers once again? Thank you so much.
I'm grateful to him for his question in the way that he has put it. He's right to say cost of living concerns are paramount. I think we've got to recognise as well the cost of petrol and diesel is often, many times, a key consideration in overall household finances. But he asked specifically, what can we do to bring down the cost of that? Now, that is about co-investing with industry in the most efficient forms of production. I think he mentions an all-singing, all-dancing EV. There's a whole range of vehicles available, and actually many of our producers have led on the kind of family cars. I mean, the Nissan Leaf is a great example of that, made by some of my former school friends in Sunderland. We should get behind that and talk about how great those products are. But fundamentally, we do need to bring down the cost, not just of the charging infrastructure, but of the unit cost itself. That can only be done by investment in efficient production and scale production. And that's why the destination is so important. But working with industry on that destination is key to delivering the outcomes I think he and I want.